Okay, I think we're ready to start. We're coming right from a very fascinating panel that tackled so many of the issues that we're going to continue to speak about in this new panel. The panel session, or the session title, is called Cooperation on Economic Security, Technology, Climate Change, Energy, and Digital Trade. That is a lot for 1 hour. Fortunately, we have experts in each of these issues, and I think we will just whet the appetite of all of you to refer back to their many publications. So, panelist to my right, Shihoko Goto. She is Director of Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues across the Indo-Pacific and is also focused on the political developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So pleased to make your acquaintance. We have many things in common. Next is Dr. Lee Q. He is the head of the New Strategy team at the Korea Institute of International Economic Policy. He's also the co-editor of the Journal of APAC Studies and co-editor and advisor to the monthly trade magazine for the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Next is Dr. Jin Young Moon. He's the head of the Global Cooperation Strategy team at the Korean Institute of International Economic Policy. He's also a research fellow with KIEP, and prior to joining KIEP, he worked for NH Investment and Future. Jane Nakano is a senior fellow in the Energy, Security, and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her research interests include U.S. energy policy, global market and policy developments concerning natural gas, nuclear energy, and critical minerals, and also energy security and climate issues in the Asia-Pacific region. We can imagine that her phone's been ringing a lot. Finally, to my left, we have Ramon Pacheco Pardo. He is KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy, the Brussels School of Governance. Professor Pardo is also Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He's an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair at CSIS. He's a non-resident fellow with Shigong Institute and a committee member at CSCAP EU. Welcome to all of you. There's so much to discuss. I'd like to open up the floor first with a question for Shihoko. One of the concepts that's increasingly discussed is the idea of economic security. In fact, national security has become synonymous with economic security. How do you view economic security, and what are the implications of the concept for the trilateral cooperation between the US, Korea, and the EU? Now, that's a small question.
Yeah. Quite frankly, we could spend like a whole forum on what exactly economic security means, etc. But first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this very august panel. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here, and it's really great that we're actually here in person as well. On economic security, it used to be that we talk about securing a path to growth. So that is not to say that there aren't risks to the global economy. The previous panel touched upon the fact that we still have macroeconomic challenges, everything from inflation to the turmoil in the financial markets, to real estate concerns, to issues about employment. But that's not what we mean with economic security within the last few years. We are really, I'm not talking about measuring living standards and the like. It's really to find the overlap or the intersection between security and economic interests, which are increasingly no longer these separate spheres. And we are seeing this great overlap. And so the coordination of those interests. And I would say that there is a greater focus on the security aspect of this at the moment, especially in the United States, rather than the economic side. Yesterday, the United States released its much long-awaited national security strategy, and it identified some obvious issues that we are aware of. Russia and China remain threats to the United States. They threaten global stability, and they also are jeopardizing US values. But what is interesting about this strategy paper is that it really opened up talking about investing in competitiveness and investing in industrial and innovation strategy. It's a de facto industrial policy, and we've already talked about that in the previous panel. But it really highlights the fact that this the introduction of the CHIPS and Science Act by the United States, and the companion piece about export restrictions to bolster the U.S. semiconductor manufacturing base. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really supposed to bring down costs of drug prices and also pave a way forward for U.S. energy security, efforts to ensure supply chain reassessments. These are all, they're not seen just as an economic move forward, but also a necessity to ensure the United States' own very survival moving forward. And so you have the non-traditional agencies like the Department of Defense really getting involved in it. Why is that? So there are a number of reasons. One is, of course, to meet the China challenge. Mariana, you can go on about this at great length and with great authority. But we are no longer underestimating the ability of China not just to catch up, but to actually take over and take the lead in the global economy. The Chinese economic threat is something that actually brings together a very divided US Congress. And there is great recognition that has bipartisan support that the United States cannot remain ahead without a significant overhaul and reinvestment in its strategic economic efforts, which require this national security strategy to be unveiled. Another concern is, of course, about economic coercion and the weaponization, essentially, of the global economy. There is, of course, a backlash against unbridled globalization for a number of years, even over the last couple of decades. But we are aware, too, that with the rise of China, with the domination of Russia and the energy sphere, that economic coercion is a great threat that requires intervention that goes beyond what free markets can actually provide. And then there is also the rise of economic statecraft, and that goes on both sides. So we talk about economic coercion by both China and the United States, but we are also seeing the rise of economic statecraft on the part of the United States and its allies and partners as well. A very good case in point of this is the situation in Ukraine. So one of the first steps that came together was to bring the United States, NATO, and its allies to come together to take strong economic action towards Russia, essentially declaring an economic war against Moscow. That there has been a great deal of unity on that front, but at the same time as the war in Ukraine persists, we also see this the limitations also of such unity and the effectiveness of economic warfare as well. So, where are the opportunities for cooperation? It is clear that we do share many countries, and especially the United States, South Korea, the European Union share same concerns. But we also have to bear in mind that there are varying degrees of concerns, especially when it comes to dealing with the China threat. But in a broader perspective, there is unity in understanding that collective pushback against Chinese economic coercion would be more effective than acting alone. There is also recognition that there is a need to protect critical technologies and that supply chains as they currently stand are incredibly vulnerable and can be weaponized by authoritarian regimes. Is there a possibility for an economic security alliance? For instance, NATO has its Article 5 of the collective defense, so there is collective action against those that attack one EU member country will trigger a collective response to spirit. Can we have that kind of collective economic mechanism in Asia together with the United States and the European Union? It is worth exploring. This is not necessarily a mainstream issue, but it does on issues that are not particularly critical. For instance, if China is boycotting Lotte as a response to THAAD deployment in South Korea, is there an ability for collective action to actually respond to that kind of threat? So this is not necessarily about the critical technologies, but to address some of the immediate economic attacks that a ally or partner nation could be facing. It is clear that much of the concerns that we have at the moment regarding economic security is based on technology and protecting the strategic assets that come with technology development. But I do want to end on a high note and say that ultimately this is not actually a digital issue, but it's an analog issue. It's an analog issue because it is about ensuring and developing trust amongst the countries. And without trust, we really cannot talk about how to deal with some of the nearshoring, reshoring industrial policies that countries, including the United States, are pursuing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Shihoko, for taking us through the issues, talking about some of the actions that have already been taken, and then really highlighting a number of opportunities for cooperation. It's a great way to set up the panel. Ramon, I'd like to turn to you now in Europe. Europe's clearly dealing with the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So how is the idea of economic security in Europe being affected by this? And also, maybe you could talk a little bit about whether the war has pushed the EU closer to thinking about the threats from China, as does the United States.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, both are excellent questions, actually. When it comes to economic security, it has to be said that, yes, in Europe, obviously, the discussion about energy is crucial. We don't know how we're going to go through the winter, if we're going to be able to go, for example, without power cuts, right? So it's something that affects everybody's lives. And what is interesting is that I think this builds on previous fears that they were in Europe, related to technology. The idea that technologically, maybe other countries, the US, but of course, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, for example, may be more advanced in certain technologies, for example, semiconductors, of course, but others as well, electric batteries, are going to be able to compete with these companies. Never mind China, we're talking here about partner countries, countries for which we have good relations, common values. So even with these countries which relations are good, that was already this year. Which takes me to the very valid point that you raised about changing perceptions of China in Europe. I would say that perceptions were changing already before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was this perception in Europe that China had changed, that it wasn't playing by the rules, and that not only wasn't playing by the rules, but it was using economic coercion. And we had examples in Europe, of course, Lithuania, Sweden as well. We have cases of Korea, Australia, so partner countries as well. So this idea that because China had changed its behavior, Europe had to change its behavior towards China. For example, you saw the introduction of investment screening mechanisms clearly targeting Chinese investment, and that was quite obvious if you could follow the political debate. But at the same time, compared to the US, I would say that there were divisions about how to deal with China. So some countries felt that it was still worth to engage. And we saw, for example, the investment treaty that the EU signed with China, that then hasn't been ratified for political reasons. And I don't think it's anywhere close to being ratified now because of the sanctions on European members of parliament, MEPs from China. But that signaled that there were politicians and member states, European countries, that were willing to still engage with China economically in a way that maybe and the US had started to move on. And then along came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think if you ask in Brussels, in most European capitals, the perception is that China has sided with Russia. We can debate whether this is the case or not, but if you talk to policymakers in Europe, that's the perception, that's the view, and this is informing policy towards China. This has led to the European Union, the European countries, France, Germany, the UK individually as well, trying to forge stronger relations with the US, but also with Asian partners on security issues, definitely, but also on economic matters as well. The number of European delegations traveling to Seoul, to Tokyo, you also have delegations going to Taipei now as well, for example. And there is, of course, the political security component, but there's also the very strong economic component. How do we strengthen economic relations with these countries for our own economic security? But on the other hand, because of the rapprochement between the US and these East Asian countries, thinking, for example, about the C4 between Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the US, there is this perception in Europe, again, going back to the previous year that I mentioned, that technologically we might not be at the same level as these other partners, that we might be left behind. And it was very interesting. I happened to be in Korea when the C4 was announced, and meeting with European envoys, not talking about the EU here, I'm talking about European envoys, different European countries in Seoul. They were knocking on the door of, Motie, the trade ministry, the foreign ministry, saying, well, what is going on here? Why are, for example, Dutch companies, British companies that are also involved in the production process of chips, why are they not being invited to the table? And now there's this push in Europe, I think in two directions. One of them to strengthen the capabilities of the European Union per se, their own independent economic capabilities, especially in the area of tech, to diversify the sources of energy imports, clearly away from Russia, for very obvious reasons. But on the other hand, that you see, and this is on the one hand, right, you see this push for more autonomy, strengthening domestic capabilities. On the other hand, reinforcing the links with other countries, for example, through FTAs, through consultations with other countries, and something as simple as reminding other countries that Europe wants to work together with them, right? But sometimes it has to be said, right, that we're willing to cooperate with you. So I think that's where we are going. So the simple answer to your question would be economic security is crucial to Europe, and it is being central to political discussions in Europe. And the longer answer is what I just explained, right? How to deal with the economic insecurities that we feel in Europe.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for that. I think it's interesting that you highlighted the fact that the Korea-US relationship is different than the Korea-EU relationship. And of course, that goes back to sort of tensions between the EU and the US. And also that these fora are different, that the US is speaking to these countries at different venues. And I want to come back to that at the end to think about how we can bring that circle around. You also focus on inter-union competition and the idea that not every country shares the same interests. And in fact, in some spheres, we're competitors. And that Europe has taken the step to try to forge stronger relationships with its Asian partners directly. It seems that may have been helped a little bit by recent developments in the energy market. And Jane, I'd like to turn to you now. Stick with the idea of economic security, but move a bit more specifically to energy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, along with US and EU sanctions, have had a significant impact on energy markets, especially in the EU. Korea has helped Europe deal with its energy crunch by allowing the diversion of some of its LNG imports to the EU. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what the war means for energy cooperation in the short to medium run, and also what are the longer term prospects for sustaining this cooperation in the energy sphere and maybe having positive spillovers to other issues in economic security. I know that's a lot.
Thank you so much for a great question, Mary. And then also thanks to the conveners of this excellent timely conference. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here. So I think we've seen significant gap between the price of natural gas, LNG in Europe and Asia, and that is really putting a lot of strain on European nations. And I think before we get to more cooperation and sustained energy piece, I think things like sharing LNG supply, I think it's very much short-lived in that whenever there is a higher price in certain markets, I think that's where the supplies of crude oil or LNG tend to flow. And as we go into the wintertime, we will likely to see more competition among markets, among buyers. And so those things are probably much more sort of temporary measures. And that certainly then points us to the way with more creative ways to come up with more sustained cooperation. What we are seeing in Europe is really unprecedented level of crisis, both in terms of energy, but then really the energy, not just the energy market crisis, but then energy economic security. But what's been remarkable is the level of commitment that the EU has shown in trying to proceed with its decarbonization commitments. The idea isn't really all of a sudden say, okay, well, it's somewhat, there are some individual country approaches that seem to point to, more dependence on fossil fuels. But, my take is that fossil fuels have things to contribute, economic security or energy security, but we still have to really address the negative attributes of fossil fuels. So it's not that fossil fuels themselves that really are evil, if you will. But anyways, I think the commitments we've seen through documents like the Repower EU have shown us that there's no U-turn. And I think Europe's commitment to shift away from Russia and particularly Russian fossil fuels really has amplified the fact that these non-fossil fuel energy sources and technologies have not just decarbonization or climate benefits, but they also have energy security benefits. And in that case, in that sense, I think it's very important message that Europe is sending to the rest of the world. And when it comes to the cooperation piece, I think we have this shared challenge to really make supply chains more robust, not just the crude oil, refined oil products and natural gas, but the clean energy technologies and components, and also including a component mineral supply chains. And of course, that will probably get us to talking a little more about the recent U.S. laws, but let me just save that for probably later, maybe Q&A. But I think when it comes to the challenge of making our supply chains more robust and resilient, I want to emphasize that the idea in my mind is not to really come up to push China out of the equation, to be honest with you. I think we all have shared interest in making the supply chains, global supply chains, more robust, because the disruptions to supply chains could come from pandemic as well as geopolitical tensions. So the idea is to make it more robust and resilient, not necessarily to have completely parallel supply chains that could really geopoliticize energy. So in that sense, I think research and innovation is a crucial space where the United States, South Korea, and the EU have a lot to cooperate. That could include coming up with substitutes for some of these minerals, also advancing technologies that do rely on, that wouldn't rely on single source sources or source countries. I mean, in that case, often it's China, but it doesn't have to be China. You know, we rely quite a bit on some of the Russian technologies or supplies, fuels when it comes to nuclear or even like nickels for EV batteries. The other important and let me also mention what's happening in Europe vis-a-vis EV battery recycling is quite exciting. I think we need to be mindful of the impact that the clean energy technologies could have on ecosystem. So it's really important for the US, South Korea, and others to see this, what EU is experimenting in that space is and as an important lesson. So the recent EU legislation is to require certain percentage of minerals to be the second life, the recovered or recycled minerals. So that's another area where we might see more sustained cooperation. And last but not least, I think standardization is a very understated, underappreciated area where we really should be cooperating more. When it comes to clean energy technologies, but especially I think when it comes to minerals, there are a lot of in many ways we haven't. I guess our collective economies haven't been as strategic about how we want to proceed setting standards on defining purity of certain minerals like lithium and how to test them and how to measure how fit they are for recovery standards. For example, one case that comes to my mind where we have been falling short on that the cooperation potential is at the International Standardization Organization. I think China has become quite active in some of the minerals working groups where their standards, their view is starting to be quite dominant, and it's not to say that that's bad. It's just that I think Washington, Brussels, and Seoul also need to have more long-term strategic view on what this may mean for our industrial partners, not just government policymakers, but then also companies that want to stay competitive in this sphere. So let me just end there and look forward to further questions later.
Thank you so much, Jane, for really discussing Europe's commitment to clean energy and how the war has highlighted the security benefits of the energy transition. I think it's something we've touched upon many times in the past. We all know that there have been many commenters who questioned German reliance, for example, on Russian energy sources. But now I think we're taking a new look at the security aspects. You also highlighted some things which I think are underappreciated, especially in the US, where we focus mostly on industrial policy, particularly related to the automobile industry and tech competition with China. I think too, with the neglect of important things like R&D and how it can be a globally beneficial spillover. Recycling seems like something your nanny wants to talk about, but something that's vitally important. And of course, standardization, which most people just like, what? But of course, it's vitally important, not only in this area, but in developing the future of digital technologies. So that was really a very broad comment. I'd like to turn to you, Virginia, now. The Moon Jae-in administration took steps in the second half of its term to address climate change, specifically pledging that Korea would become carbon neutral by 2050. Can you tell us a little bit about the energy policies of the Yoon administration? What do they look like? And where do you see as the most promising aspect for cooperation between Korea, the EU, and the US? Also, if you could, you might talk a little bit about how we have seen EU and US cooperation on things like green steel. But how can South Korea become an equal partner in those discussions? So really, how can we establish a broader framework for these very important coordination issues in the energy transition?
Morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to discuss as a kind of a challenging issue. I'm very happy to answer that question. Actually, I'm not the energy guy. Since I joined here, I have been involved in the climate change issue, but the energy issue and then climate change issues are highly related. So we need to think about together. Now, energy security is more big challenge for us. So last May, the Presidential Transition Committee announced 110 national agenda of new administration. And then they have two kind of commitment for the energy and environment issue. One is the innovative growth with the advanced economy. And another one is the climate and environment policy direction for sustainable future. The new government wants to address energy security and create new energy industry and market with several measures. The first one is the energy mix needs to be adjusted to consider balance between renewable energy and the nuclear power. And second one is the enhancing stability of energy supply chain by securing supply of critical mineral and diversifying energy import control. And third is creation of a new energy industry, including wind, solar, and hydrogen sector, and demand management by combining technologies such as AI, Internet of Things, and big data. Former government announced the hydrogen economy roadmap in 2019, and US government wants to supply hydrogen industry with the production and supply of clean hydrogen. Considering recent energy crisis in Europe, nuclear has an important role as a stable resource to access the transition to clean carbon neutrality. Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy released a draft of 10-stage plan for electric power supply on last summer. And the plan predicts how supply and demand for the next 15 years. The core part of the plan reverses the preceding government's plan by raising the proportion of nuclear power generation from 23.9% to 32.8% by 2030, while lowering the share of renewable energy-based power generation from roughly 30% to 21%. That's a big change. As new administration pledged to rebuild the nuclear power industry and support its expansion overseas, cooperation in the nuclear industry is the most promising area for cooperation. During the presidential campaign, the president had pledged to resume construction of 2 domestic nuclear reactors and aims to export 10 nuclear reactors by 2030. When President Biden and Yoon met Seoul last May, their joint statement recognized the importance of nuclear energy as an integral part of enhancing global energy security. They committed to greater nuclear energy collaboration by jointly using export promotion and capacity building, and more resilient nuclear supply chain. Actually, in order to achieve European Green Deal and induce private investment, as Mitchell noted, the EU taxonomy aims to guide private investment by providing list of what is the environmentally sustainable economic activity. European Commission present a taxonomy complementary climate delegated act last February, and then the act set out the technical screening criteria for certain gas and nuclear activities to be added as transitional activities. The European Parliament did not object the Commission's taxonomy delegated act last summer. Therefore, I think the trilateral cooperation will be needed to enhance the investment and R&D of transitional resources. And then another question is, many mentioned is maybe I can talk about the later, But I think the European Green Deal has lots of kind of the aim, and one of them is CBA. And then Korea is very how can I say? You watch it seriously, and we know that there are two-step kind of the CBA, and then also the kind of negotiation between US and EU for the kind of the how can they see the intensity of carbon, and how we can measure. What will be the MRP? That's all a challenging issue. I think I can say it later, but I think the standard and the rule we need to be collaborating together. Yeah, that's
Thank you so much for very briefly giving us an overview of what's happening in the Union administration in the area of addressing climate change and energy. And I'm particularly interested in your emphasis on nuclear power. And it brings me back to what Shihoko said about the importance of trust, because this is an area where national, citizens are concerned about the safety of nuclear power. It's certainly in the EU and even in the US. And so trust is highly important as we move forward. I'd like to turn now to Q. Yes, you're coming. Your time has come. We have a lot of topics on this panel, but I want to move to digital trade. And here again, we have an important issue in terms of trust. Digital trade is expanding quickly, and yet national rules haven't really kept up with the need for interoperability and other issues. The EU has GDP, and they're looking into regulating other areas in the digital space. Korea has been taking steps to regulate digital trade with its app payments. The US, we keep talking about it. I'm not sure what my iPhone is doing at this very minute in my purse. So, but with the US, EU, and Korea seemingly, having areas of divergence on digital trade, but everyone telling us this is the fastest growing area of trade. It's potentially a boom for workers being involved, service sector workers being more involved in getting more of the benefits of globalization. It's kind of viewed as one bright spot of globalization. What do you see as options for cooperation among the three regions we're talking about today?
Wow. Okay. I'm Q from Kiev. And first of all, I'm trade economist. I thought I finished my homework during my 13-hour flight, but somehow the question is kind of expanded wider than I don't know how to cope with this difficult situation, but let me try. I'd like to respond that data governance is the most important area for cooperation among the US and EU and Korea, and competition is the second. My response is based on EPA, not the digital partnership agreement. In this case, digital policy alert database. Since January 2020, DPA has been tracking policy and regulatory changes affecting cross-border digital commerce, digital trade, electronic commerce, whatever you say. And the primary focus countries are EU, G20 countries, plus Switzerland. Now, I have found 3 facts from the database. First one, I bring several numbers. The first one is between January 1st in 2020 and October 9th in 2022, the day before yesterday, and I looked up, then between that 2 periods, the European and G20 governments took 3,801 legal and regulatory steps in digital sectors. Huge number. And second, during the same time period, that 3,801 significant events resulted in 2,161 policy or regulatory changes. Okay. The last one is directly related to my answer. Data governance online content moderation, and competition law enforcement are three of the most active areas of the state intervention. I realized that two of the three areas are important to the US, the EU, and Korea. And this refers to data governance and competition, not online content moderation. Now let's look at one by one. Data governance is the G20 economy's most active area of the state intervention. It covers, like it already mentioned in the first session, like data protection regulation, by the way, GDPR in the EU, the cross-border data transfers, and the cybersecurity regulation already mentioned in the first session, and probably Michael said that. And about 58% of the 1,567 steps have already resulted in state action in data governance. Huge number again. And policy or regulatory changes in data governance have been detected in the US, in the EU, and Korea. That's the first thing. So we should look at the data governance prior. The second one, the online content moderation, that's the second most active area of the state intervention. 545, that's the number. And then actually 287 actions can be found, but except Korea, there's no number for Korea, okay? Eliminate. The last one is competition law enforcement. That's the third most active area of state intervention. Access to app stores and in-app payment systems, combining user data across services and platform operators and favoring themselves over the business users have been the focus of competition, legislation, and enforcement. The 495 legal and regulatory steps advanced 252 policy or regulatory changes. Many changes were detected in the EU, including the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. 53 changes can be found in the US, 11 in Korea. In-app payments, as mentioned by our moderator Mary, are in Korea, the in-app payment system, that law is currently being considered. So let's move on to the question again. So Mary mentioned that regulatory models appear to be diverging, right? I want to say, we can say that regulatory models in the US, the EU, and Korea are actually diverging, I guess. In other words, we can phrase it like this: uncoordinated state action in the digital domain continues. We can see that from the statistics and from the database. Uncoordinated digital regulations, as we know, can lead to trade conflicts, right? Or tensions, not only on the topics of in-app payments, but also on the issues ranging from data governance to competition. So this is my last comment. Regulatory heterogeneity creates a regulatory uncertainty. In economics, uncertainty equals to cost, and increases the risk of data fragmentation. Unfair competition would be detrimental to the global digital ecosystem. Policymakers and regulators in the three countries, I mean the US, the EU, and Korea, need to strengthen policy and regulatory cooperation in these two. What it is, that's data governance and competition. The prior is data governance, and then we have to, I mean, at least three countries, including Korea, have to look at the competition law enforcement. That's the second thing. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Q. And I can tell you're an economist. I love the numbers, but also you did a good job on your homework and responding to my question. Wow, we've discussed a lot and time is running short. So I'd like to give each person just 2 minutes to respond to kind of an off-the-cuff question. Yeah, and I know you're all nimble on your feet. In the last session, Robert Zoellick emphasized the need to reach out beyond the trilateral grouping to partners and potential partners in South Asia, Africa, Latin America. What forms do you think such discussions could such discussions take place, or how should they be incorporated into thinking about the trilateral relationship? All of the issues we touched on: supply resilience, energy transition, digital trade, solving the climate, the carbon decarbonization, all require much wider cooperation with other countries. In fact, if we look at not just carbon emissions, we know who the top carbon emitters are, but we look at who's increasing the fastest, it's outside of the normal trio that we're talking about. So how do we reach out to these partners outside while trying to strengthen the trilateral? So I know that's a lot. I'll go quickly. Let me start with you, Junwoon. Just go right down the table. 2 minutes.
Actually, when I involved the climate negotiation, especially in finance, so everybody talk about the finance, the importance, because the developed country and developing country has a different objective. The developing country wants kind of the support from developed country, and then developed country also call for the action together. That's why we have Paris Agreement. But to involve the multilateral cooperation and all the cooperation globally, we need to think of how we can solve the climate change issue together. Then we need some kind of incentive or support for the mitigation or adaptation. And also we have to think about how we can act together. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the EU and US is talking about lots of kind of the standard issue, especially EU is doing a lot. So EU has the due diligence, kind of ESG, and then disclosure kind of requirement for corporate sustainable finance. And also they talk about the CBAM. All of the related with kind of the trade issue or the investment issue. So we can think of carefully, and then we need to work together to solve the basically problem of the climate change issue and energy issue together. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Very important issue. So I'll go over to you.
Yeah, so there's kind of proliferation of new partnerships and ways to work together on common themes. I think we talked about trade both in this panel and the panel before, but I was particularly struck by the fact no one mentioned IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the United States launched. The motivation for that are numerous. We can talk about the downside of it as well, but it is an effort really to reach out to unlikely or partners and to really kind of ensure that there are ways to group countries that are swayable or already firmly committed into the US sphere. So you see in IPEF in Southeast Asia, and let us not forget the Pacific island of Fiji that has entered as well. And we've seen the emergence of AUKUS, we've seen the Quad really take on new responsibilities and the like. The challenge is that there are too many, and there are various agencies that are involved in all of these and other efforts. There needs to be better coordination, both within countries, so that there is we talk about standardization and interoperability, so that we can actually move forward and it doesn't simply end up in rhetoric. This current US administration has really not shied away from talking about working together with partners. There hasn't been a lot to show for it. There are specific deliverables that really need to be met on supply chain resilience, on climate sustainability and the like. But I do think some of the more immediate concerns about standardization and the harmonization of rules, especially if we're talking, for instance, about the Chip 4 Alliance and the semiconductor front, which is United States, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. there is this opportunity to really focus on some of the standardization of what should not be exported to China, yes, but what can be exported to China as well. And I think Taiwan is a good role model in kind of meeting that balance of having this cooperation and competition with China. So that's a very long-winded answer to say there's a lot going on, but there's not a lot of progress.
Great, thank you so much. Ramon?
I think it depends on the issue, right? When it comes to climate change, multilateralism seems to be still holding, thankfully. So that won't work for all areas clearly, but for some areas it might. Something that I find interesting is that when you're talking in Europe about the upcoming G20 summit, there is a relief that it's happening in Indonesia, that it's not happening in a Western country because it's more of a neutral venue. And there's discussion, could this actually serve, because we should remember we had the pandemic, so we didn't have these face-to-face meetings between leaders. So there's this hope that somehow could this actually help to reignite cooperation in certain areas. Obviously, there were many problems with especially Putin goes there. It will be very difficult for Europe, I would imagine, for the US to deal with this. But could in some areas, maybe energy security, for example, tech, could this be a forum to discuss at least these issue areas? But I should also say that my perception, discussing this with European policymakers, and last week we had a very good Spain-Japan dialogue actually in Kyoto, is that Japan, Korea, of course, Europe have given up in many areas on this idea that could be multilateral cooperation or even unilateral cooperation. There is mistrust towards certain countries, for example, increasing mistrust towards India because of its position when it comes to Russia. Can it actually really be trusted? So I think we see this move towards having more cooperation between so-called like-minded partners, which I agree with Shihoko, we should reach out beyond them. But I don't see political will in many areas to actually do this. I think it depends on the issue area, but in some of them might be difficult to reach out to the countries you would really need to have at the discussion table.
Okay, wow. Jane?
So I do agree with Shihoko. I think there's a bit of proliferation of all these different fora. But then I also agree with Ramon that I think it's somewhat energy, well, even within the energy universe, it's somewhat energy technology or field specific. So things like the hydrogen ministerial could be a very good place for both the public and private sector stakeholders to start talking about what more could be done about, looking at the emissions, better understanding the emissions profile to make sure that hydrogen application really helps the climate, goals. And, of course, EU has robust, vision, and then of course Korea is very much interested in hydrogen being the, important, component. And of course, the US has massive funding to become a major producer as well as consumer of hydrogen. But it depends, critical minerals has its own sort of, set of challenges, and also stakeholders, government, partners. So I'm sorry, I wish I had a good answer, like a single platform. But for now, I think we just have to be mindful that we don't end up coming up with too many vehicles and then really stress the amount of bureaucrats and experts that are available to be able to implement. So thanks.
Q, you have the last word.
Last word, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't finish my homework, then you lose unburden my okay. Probably I want to go back to the last comment in the first session. Nicholas mentioned that we have to cooperate, that we have to keep talking. I feel like we know the answer with different emphasis, I guess. The Shihoko mentioned the collective actions, and Jane and Shihoko again in a different context, but the standards and the regulation, the governance, and so on. This is very important. And then the common aim, and then the find out the common word very similar approaches in terms of policy. But that kind of thing is generally the answer. In the detailed part, I want to say the standards and technology governance is extremely important in this world, I guess. In particular, connecting to the topics in the session one, we talked about the economics, of course, the economic security, of course, the energy, digital, and so on. Very complex. We don't know what's going to happen. The US and China and the EU and everything. So we have to think about rule-based in the system of the digital ecosystem or digital space and so on. Now, we can experiment with a lot of stuff, export control, sanction, investment screening, but I really want to emphasize standards and the technology and governance in order to expect the situation in order to drag or take China into the rule-based system, then rule, standards, governance. That's the priority thing that we have to pursue with the three of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to thank our panelists who obviously could have said so much on each of these topics. Thank you to Jinyu Moon, to Shihoko Goto, to Ramon Pardo, Jane Nakano, and Kluge. Thank you all for being here and for imparting your wisdom to us today. Thanks very much.